Good morning. The hearing will now come to order. I want to thank everyone for attending today's hearing on the Globalization of Research and Development and Innovation, Part 3, How do Companies Choose Where to Build R&D Facilities. This is a third in the Science and Technology Committee's series of hearings on the topic, and the first to explore the phenomena from the point of view of businesses looking for the optimal location for R&D facilities. More importantly, and most relevant to this committee, we are interested in hearing what our country can do to attract business R&D facilities and keep them here in the United States. The Science and Technology Committee just led the Congress in passing the America Competes Act, which strengthened R&D and education programs that will make our country more innovative and our students more successful in science, math, and engineering. But as we'll hear from our witnesses today, competitiveness, especially on the regional level, depends on far more than a well-prepared technical workforce and first-class R&D facilities. For a business looking to locate an R&D facility, other factors matter also, like access to transportation, favorable government policies, good local universities, and employee necessities such as affordable housing and access to quality health care. In 1993, the Oregon legislature created the Strategic Investment Program, or SIP. The goal was to attract high-tech companies to Oregon, specifically the semiconductor industry. The program allows for a 15-year property tax abatement, among other factors. Most importantly, the program is administered by local government so that they can use it as they please. Washington County, in my congressional district, has actively used this to attract companies. And Intel, Sun Microsystems, Genentech, and a number of other high-tech companies have located facilities in the region, providing quality jobs to local communities. SIP is not the only factor that makes Oregon competitive for recruiting high-tech firms, but it is one example of a government policy designed to attract companies to stay in the United States. To understand the challenges facing our country, we need a better understanding of who we're competing against for R&D facilities. While trends in R&D site selection are not well tracked, recent announcements show that many R&D facilities are being placed outside the United States. According to Site Selection magazine, 22 of the 25 largest facility investments in semiconductor plants since January 2006 have occurred in Asia, including 9 of the top 10. While this is not a complete one-on-one track with R&D, R&D frequently follows such investments and vice versa. Of course, we need far more data and information to truly quantify the extent to which companies are building facilities overseas, and even more information to understand why. Some of our witnesses today will discuss the extent to which low-cost countries have been able to attract the offshoring of high-tech work. Because this is an emerging challenge, there are differing viewpoints on the scale of the globalization of R&D and innovation. I'm sure we will have a lively debate on this topic, which will hopefully give us a better background on the competition among countries and regions. 2 of our witnesses come from the practitioner end of the site selection field and will be able to address more of the why. I'm interested in hearing both how companies make decisions on where to locate and what we can do to entice them to locate in America, because America would be better off if we could find ways to maximize a company's economic success while creating good jobs here in the United States. It is my hope that we will be able to strike this balance between the interests of multinationals and creating jobs and R&D facilities here in the United States. The chair now recognizes Dr. Gingrey, our ranking member of the subcommittee, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding these hearings, as you said, the third in our series, and certainly an incredibly important issue of the location of research and development, science, technology, and engineering intensive facilities of private companies. In the technology-based economy of the 21st century, it's vital that we enact policies that continue to make the United States a viable and attractive option for companies when they decide where they will place these essential facilities. Our panel this morning will provide us with a wealth of information on this issue, both from academia and the private sector, to help us shape future policies that will inevitably affect our economy for generations to come. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from each of you. For companies, there are a multitude of factors that are considered when choosing to locate R&D facilities, whether that location is in the United States or elsewhere in the world. Our country is seen as being on the cutting edge of R&D, yet we continue to see the emergence of companies choosing offshore locations as an alternative to the United States. Other countries have used the United States as a model for economic prosperity through attracting investment in available resources, including human capital. These countries have invested in their own intellectual infrastructure by placing an extra emphasis on science and engineering to the point where a large percentage of graduates are in these fields. According to a recent study, 50% of students in China receive their undergraduate degrees in natural science or engineering. In Singapore, that number is 67%, and 38% of South Korea graduates fall into these fields. Unfortunately, the United States is lagging behind with a staggering 15% of graduates in natural science or engineering. So I'm glad that the work of this committee, through the American Competes Act, begins to address this shortcoming. We still have a large gap, of course, to close in this area. Furthermore, we've seen that China has made some of the most aggressive steps in advancing R&D, while we have chosen to place our federal priorities elsewhere. China has founded the China Science Foundation that is modeled after the United States, and China is increasing its investment in science. R&D activities rose 500% in China between 1991 and 2002, from $14 billion to $54 billion, while during that same period, domestic R&D spending only increased by 140%, from $177 billion to $244 billion. Mr. Chairman, if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, we should be very flattered when it comes to R&D. Unfortunately, all of this flattery has had a profoundly negative effect for our economy. For example, according to Site Selection magazine, 22 of the 25 largest facility investments in semiconductor plants, the Chairman has mentioned that, since January 2006, occurred in Asia, including 9 of the top 10. These are jobs that very easily could be held by hard-working Americans and stimulating our domestic economy. Instead, we're watching these jobs go overseas, and the United States fall further behind in an area of such importance to the future of our nation. The United States has historically been a leader in high-tech, cutting-edge innovation. Through a combination of increased domestic STEM education, which this committee has worked so diligently on, facilitation of domestic investment in R&D, and collaboration on R&D policy, the United States can reclaim this leadership role. So I await the testimony of our witnesses on how we can address these critical issues facing our committee. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Gingrey. If there are other members who wish to submit opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this point, I would like to introduce our witnesses. Dr. Martin Kenney is Professor of Human and Community Development at the University of California, Davis, and Senior Project Director at the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Robert Atkinson is the President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Mr. Steve Morris is Executive Director of the Open Technology Business Center in Beaverton, Oregon. Mr. Mark Sweeney is a Senior Principal at McCallum Sweeney Consulting. Dr. Jerry Thursby will be introduced by Dr. Gingrey in a moment. And as our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes. Your written testimony will be submitted in full. And after your testimony, the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. And Dr. Gingrey, if you would care to introduce our witness.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Of course, it's always a great pleasure to have someone from my alma mater, the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, Georgia, to be with us as a witnesses. They do such a great job, and we're looking forward today, Mr. Chairman, to hearing from all the witnesses, including my colleague from Georgia Tech, Dr. Jerry Thursby. He is a member of the Strategic Management faculty. Dr. Thursby holds the Ernest Scheller Jr. Chair at Georgia Tech in Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Commercialization. He's been published extensively in the areas of econometrics, international trade, and the commercialization of early-stage technologies, with a particular interest in the role of university science in national innovation systems. His work, Mr. Chairman, has appeared in such prestigious publications as the American Economic Review, the Journal of the American Statistical Association, Management Science, and Science. And he currently serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Technology Transfer and is an associate editor of the Journal of Productivity Analysis. I'm disappointed that his wife, Dr. Marie Thursby, is not with us today. I had some stellar things to say about her as well. Dr. Thursby informed me before we started the hearing, Mr. Chairman, that she's in the classroom teaching, and I think that is fantastic because some of the students, particularly those freshmen and sophomores, they really need the very best and the brightest that we have to offer, and Dr. Marie Thursby is certainly part of that effort, and we're proud to have him with us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gingrey, and we will now start with our witness testimony, and we will start with Dr. Kenney. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to take part in this important hearing. For the past 5 years with Rafiq Dosani at Stanford University and funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Industry Studies grants, I have been studying services offshoring to lower wage economies. Today, my remarks will focus on India and China. R&D globalization is not new. Large U.S. firms have had laboratories in high labor cost foreign nations for decades. Conversely, most large foreign firms have U.S. R&D operations. The new phenomenon is the rapid expansion of R&D facilities operated by U.S. firms in China and India. The main reasons for offshoring, for R&D offshoring to China are a combination of product localization, government pressure, proximity to key customers, but cost is an important factor. In the case of India, cost and decreasing the time to market are the primary motivations. All assume that there are skilled persons available. The Indian and Chinese R&D workforces are growing rapidly. Today, there are approximately 140,000 R&D, engineering services, and software products workers in the Indian export sector. It is growing at about 20% per annum, and sales will be approximately $8 billion in 2007. Overall, in 2006, India exported $31.9 billion of services. Total employment was 1.25 million. A recent OECD report using Chinese government statistics estimated that China has 1.1 million S&T researchers. There are no statistics regarding how many are exporting R&D services, but it's surely very small, though they may be exporting their services embodied in physical goods. As a comparison, the NSF data for 2003 finds that approximately 1.16 million U.S. workers are engaged in private sector R&D. An increasing number of U.S. IT firms have their largest foreign workforce in India. To illustrate, as of 2007, Adobe India had 1,000 employees, filed for 50 patents, and had global responsibility for producing software upgrades for two key products, PageMaker and FrameMaker. Today, IBM has in excess of 60,000 Indian employees and over 100 PhD researchers. With IBM setting the pace, other U.S. IT service providers are expanding in India. This is not surprising since competition with the Indian service providers with their far lower cost basis is heated. Firms in other industries are offshoring. The GM R&D laboratory in Bangalore employs 500 professionals. GE has 4 R&D locations globally. GE's New York research headquarters employs approximately 1,900. The new Munich Center employs 150, and the Shanghai Center employs approximately 150. The Bangalore Center has nearly 3,000 researchers. Also, the Indian service providers have large contract R&D arms. For example, Wipro, with 15,000 engineering professionals, claims to be the world's largest contract engineering firm. Less is known about the extent and type of MNC R&D in China. For 2004, the OECD found that 166 firms had R&D facilities. The largest employer, Motorola, had 1,600 engineers in China. These MNCs were most likely to be developing new products or modifying existing products for the Chinese market. Less prevalent was the exploration of new products for the global market or basic research. There's significant concern about intellectual property protection in China, and yet despite the IP protection situation, MNCs are increasing their R&D commitment. There are clear differences between the two nations. First, much of the R&D in China is localization work or developing products for the domestic market. In India, the focus is cost reduction and reducing time to market for products intended for the global market. The conceptualization and architecting of new products, strategic research planning, and product road mapping will, for the most part, remain in the United States. In terms of industry, R&D globalization is furthest advanced in the IT sector. In traditional manufacturing firms, R&D globalization is less advanced but growing rapidly. The pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries are offshoring drug R&D more slowly. Many nations have tax, cash, and in-kind incentives to attract R&D. China has schemes to encourage R&D by both domestic firms and MNCs. Also, informal pressure is used on the MNCs. As a generalization, India has no specific incentives. In India, R&D, like most other exported services, operates in technology parks where firms are exempt from all corporate income tax until 2010. One vital U.S. research strength is our research universities that remain the finest in the world. Congress has done a remarkable job in providing research funds that have kept us at the cutting edge. With the America Competes Act, more monies are to be appropriated to the physical sciences and engineering. What might we do to ensure our continuing supremacy? First, we need to find ways to address the spiraling cost of graduate education. Second, to ensure the continuing supremacy of U.S. research universities in the information sciences, Congress might consider creating a National Institute of Information Sciences. The operation of the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act has, in many cases, spawned university bureaucracies that retard technology transfer. 4, with understanding that innovation requires information, it is vital to reestablish the balance between patent protection and increasing the stock of freely usable knowledge. The lowering of technological, legal, and political barriers to trade has made R&D globalization a natural outcome. It is impossible in the current political and economic environment to see how this trend can be reversed. However, the implications of offshoring may be felt most acutely in the next recession, when firms must decide whether and where to eliminate excess employees. For high-wage nations, success in the global economy is ever more dependent on the ability to grow new industries. Innovation, entrepreneurship, technology, and science are keys to continuing prosperity. There are enormous opportunities for the U.S. economy, which is the most diverse and creative in the world. Success will be based on increasing the capabilities within our workforce, even as large numbers of capable workers paid far less than ours enter the global labor market. Fashioning policies to meet this new challenge will be difficult, but as a nation, we have no choice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Kenney. Dr. Atkinson, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Gingrey, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you. I've focused on this issue of both economic development and site location, and particularly in the R&D area for a long time, including when I was a project director at the former Congressional Office of Technology Assessment. And I think there's one of the issues that's hard to understand about this particular challenge is that it's relatively new. There isn't as much research on it as we would like, but even given that, I think there are some things that we can say somewhat definitively about what's happening, why it's happening. I don't think there's any doubt that there's been a significant increase in U.S. offshoring of R&D in the last decade. In that last decade, the share of U.S. firms' R&D sites went from 59% of them being here in the U.S. to 52% being in the U.S. The share in China and India increased from 8 to 18%. So decline in the U.S. and the increase is largely in China and India. According to a recent survey by the Industrial Research Institute, which is a trade association of R&D managers, U.S. R&D managers, over 60% of U.S. companies are investing R&D in China, 50% in India, 20% in Eastern Europe, and that's growing faster than their R&D investments in other places. I think if you look at the effect of that, there's some debate about that. Is this a complement or a substitute? I think the evidence is pretty clear. It's a substitute. According to BEA numbers, between 1998 and 2003, which are the latest data that they provide, investment in R&D by U.S. Majority-owned affiliates increased outside the U.S. by 52%. Total R&D, corporate R&D in the U.S. by U.S. and non-U.S. firms, so include insourcing of R&D, increased by just 26%, so at half the rate. And that trend has gone recently, just in 2005 to 2007, U.S. rates increased about half of the rest of the world. What's driving this? I think you'll hear a debate, I think, probably today, and there's a debate somewhat in the literature, but I would agree with Dr. Kenney. I think at the end of the day, while there are multiple factors that determine particular types of R&D outsourcing or offshoring by the type of R&D, by the type of firm, by the type of country, cost, I would argue, is the major driver. That's not to say that access to market and access to talent aren't a factor, but I think cost is the major driver. You've got salaries for R&D personnel in China that are 1/6 of the U.S., and a very good talent over there. So, for example, a recent Booz Allen Hamilton study showed that when it comes to moving R&D to developing nations, low-cost skills base was the predominant factor. And I would differentiate between developing and developed. Cost is not a big factor, or really the major factor in going to a developed country, because the cost differential is not that great. It is, I would argue, the major factor in going to a developing country. Again, an IRI study showed that the two biggest factors for going offshore and anywhere combined was number one, lower cost talent, and number two, lower cost facilities and materials. And I think one of the reasons why some studies have shown that access to talent is an important factor is akin somewhat to Mr. Chairman, you can appreciate that. It's sort of, I use the analogy, you're not going to have a lumber and wood products firm locate in the desert. They have to locate in where there's timber. And you're not going to have an R&D facility locate where there are no R&D scientists and engineers. So that's kind of the baseline. You have to have that. Once you have that, then the question of cost comes into play, and I think plays a very important role. So China has a lot of skilled R&D engineers, scientists, as does India, and the fact that the low cost is important. I'll just add a point on incentives. I think incentives sometimes don't get picked up as much in the survey instruments because they're not the driver. But the way firms make these decisions is they don't just look at incentives and then labor cost and facilities cost. They combine them all together into a cost estimate. When you do that, I actually think incentives play an important role. The U.S., for example, was number one in 1990, had the most generous research and development tax credit of any of the OECD nations, the 30 OECD nations. In 2005, we were 17th most generous. And that's partly because our credit has gone down, mostly because other countries have looked at this and said, we want to be an attractive location for R&D, we're going to put in place these incentives. So Mexico has a more generous incentive than we do. China has a very aggressive incentive, so does India. The last point on this is, Dr. Kenney mentioned government pressure. I think forced technology transfer is an important issue, particularly in China, where the government pressures U.S. companies to get access to their market to move R&D facilities over there. It's a direct violation of the WTO, and it's something that we don't really, frankly, as a country, do very much about. Three quick things I think we can do. We recently issued 2 reports on the R&D tax credit. First one showing, I think, very clear economic study showing it's an effective tax tool. We think we need to significantly increase the credit, and I'd be happy to share that report with you, our specific recommendations. We need to do more on supporting R&D at the federal level. The American Compete Act went a long way towards that. We've got a new report coming out proposing the creation of a National Innovation Foundation. Third, while skills, I think, are not the driver, it is important that we have good skills here. And we need to do that at two levels. One is domestically, so again, the American Compete Act, it took important steps there, but also in terms of making sure that we are open towards the best and the brightest from the rest of the world coming here, including H-1B visas and letting people with a graduate degree stay here. And lastly, and I think it's, again, an area we haven't looked at enough, but we need to more aggressively combat these foreign practices. I don't think there's a problem with countries investing in science or skills or in R&D credit. It's very different, though, when they use unfair practices to force U.S. companies to put R&D there. I would argue our trade policy hasn't done enough there, and that's something we should do more of. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atkinson. Mr. Morris, please proceed.
Oops. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to just talk before you today. I would like to, I guess, bring a sort of a technology business background approach to this, and more recently, my focus really has been on startups, although I've been at larger companies too. And I'd like to, I guess, talk about some of my observations, at least, as to what's important. Many of the factors that have already been talked about are clearly key in deciding where you're going to locate an R&D facility. If you don't have the workforce and the infrastructure that's required for that technology, it isn't happen. If you don't have IP protection, it's less likely to happen. If it's not an attractive place to recruit employees and retain employees, it makes it more difficult. Access to technology, if you don't have the universities, you don't have the strategic partners you want to work with, again, it's not as likely to happen. I guess my theme would be you have to build on your strengths. We're not going to lead in every possible aspect of our. We can pick our battles. You know, what technologies are we strong in? Let's invest in the existing clusters in those areas, invest in the R&D. Certainly work on the K through 12 system in this country, because that's important not only for recruiting employees. Employees care about the education of their kids, but clearly that creates the future workforce. But I guess that the area I'd like to talk about a little more, which is more uniquely my focus, is one of what I think is our big advantages, which is entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial. That's a very strong thing for this country. It's relatively easy to start a company in the U.S. Culturally, entrepreneurship is an okay thing to do. It's encouraged. It's not frowned upon the way it is in some other countries. And a lot of innovations happen in this country because where I think there are some important things we can do to strengthen that, which will relate directly to attracting more R&D operations to this country. A couple of examples from Oregon. We have an IBM facility for open source software in Beaverton. The reason that's there is because they bought a startup company called Sequent Computers in Beaverton, and that brought IBM to the area. They saw then that there was a great workforce and a lot of other advantages for an open source software group. It ended up getting located there. It's an example where what started as a very small startup actually attracted a very large R&D organization into the area. Second example, more on the smaller end, because of our strength in entrepreneurship and because of our strengths in specific markets and technologies, we have an opportunity to attract more entrepreneurs to come to the U.S. from offshore to start their startups here. Again, a recent example in Oregon, a company called Lunar with 2 R's, started by an entrepreneur from Japan who had a very successful company there, sold it, came to the U.S. to start Lunar because, number one, it's a Web 2.0 company, and he looked at the U.S. as being a better market, so we had an advantage there. Two, he needed strategic partners in Web 2.0. They were here. And number 3, he found the workforce that he needed, which he was hard to find in Japan. He decided on Portland as opposed to California, mainly because of quality of life for his employees. So now, yes, it's a small company, but of course, Google was a small company once, and clearly that's the bet you make when you invest in startups, is that some of them will be home run. The third example I wanted to mention is something we're beginning to have success with at OTBC, the incubator in Beaverton for technology startups, where we've realized that small software, open source software companies in Japan are having a hard time recruiting the engineers they need. We've explained to them that we have a lot of those things here, and we're making it very easy for small companies who normally wouldn't be opening an R&D operation in the U.S. at this stage, say with 20 or 30 people. Well, as an incubator, we can make that very easy for them. So we just signed our first lease with a software company from Japan at OTBC. We've got a verbal commit from a second one and a funnel of at least 10 more companies that look like good prospects over the next 1 to 2 years. So again, these are small, but they all have very good growth potential, and some of them will be growing into big. So I'd really like to suggest that a part of a strategy for attracting R&D investments from big and small companies, that whole strategy really should include a focus on entrepreneurship, because it is such a strength, and there are some things we need to address to make that even stronger. Like specific issue we have right now is the migration of venture capital to much later stage companies. It's very difficult these days to raise seed level money. Absolutely something that could be improved with some government policies. So I'd urge the committee to consider those more startup oriented. Some of them will grow to be big.
Thank you very much, Steve. Mr. Sweeney, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. Pleased to be here today. I'm going to speak to you from the trenches. My firm is a site selection firm. We help companies decide where to build their facilities. So we work with them directly on the types of location decisions this committee is interested in. Our firm does help all kinds of companies from all over the world, look all over the world, and we do support all types of activities, office, including R&D, manufacturing, and distribution. The site selection process can be seen from a lot of different perspectives. Perhaps the most helpful is to see it as bringing geography issues into a company's capital investment decision. When a company sees an opportunity, whether it's for a new product or a new market or demand for enhanced research and development or customer service, once they have that opportunity in front of them, they need to decide where. Because where they do something has a very large impact on how successful they will be. The factors that go into the where question cover a lot of the same bases, but in their details will be different for each type of project, for each type of company, and even change over the life of the decision. In the early stages of our projects, it's important for us to understand our clients' strategic drivers, what this investment is all about, what this opportunity is all about, as well as the operational drivers. What are the specific things associated with this project that are going to be impacted and different depending on where they actually locate. In general, we examine 3 broad areas of factors: physical factors, operating factors, and living factors. Physical factors can include things like sites, buildings, and all types of infrastructure. And as you might imagine, the demands for those will vary greatly from project to project. Operating factors are factors that influence the decision and the location over the life of the project. A big component of that is labor and all the issues that go into labor evaluations, availability, quality, cost, etc. Utilities, utility effectiveness, reliability, utility cost. For industrial projects, transportation is usually very important, and then taxes and incentives are a factor in every site selection. On the living conditions side, that gets into quality of life issues, the community assets in a company, in a community, the housing market, medical services, the security of the company, cultural and recreational assets. Again, the various weights on these factors will depend on the particular project and on the stage of the project, but we generally deal with all of those factors on all projects. When we get to a final stage, the way we manage our projects, when we get to the final phase, having done both desktop and fieldwork analysis on all the factors I mentioned, We will have finalists that are generally acceptable locations for our client's project. What that means is the final decision is being made between strong, viable candidates. Incentive negotiations tend to become most intense at the end of the project, and as a result do have significant influence, because at that point you're trying to make distinctions among viable locations, and incentives can help accentuate the strengths, mitigate the weaknesses, and sharpen the differences between your finalist locations. Now, for research and development facilities, let me back up a moment. Projects at the very beginning can often be seen as, in a very broad sense, either being driven by site and physical factors or being driven by people and human resource factors. Now, all of those factors get involved in all projects, but that's sort of where the general tone starts. Research and development projects will be people-driven projects. All of the factors are important, but perhaps the primary, most important factor is access to quality talent. That can be talent that's currently available in a location, but just as important, the ability to recruit and retain that talent into your candidate location. For R&D, that recruitment is going to take place on a global level. So your ability to attract talented people from around the world into your community is going to have a big influence on our final decision. You've heard a lot from my esteemed fellows here on the panel about the trends in research and development. Those offshore trends are impacting all types of activity. Countries have recognized that R&D is a great basis for future competitive economic activity, and by establishing advantages in R&D, they are positioning themselves not only to win that battle, but positioning to win future economic development battles as R&D efforts get commercialized. Countries outside of the obvious ones like China and India, countries like Singapore and even our neighbors in North America, Canada and Mexico, have taken very aggressive stances to recruit research and development. In the U.S., there are some opportunities for us to recompete and reestablish our leadership. Some of those would include the big science project or the big vision, something along the lines of NASA that will not only energize the country, but create great types of research and potential spin-offs, and at the same time hopefully energize younger Americans to find science and engineering paths, career paths, more attractive. Tax and finance policies, the U.S., as has been shown here, has fallen way behind on tax policy and has very little in terms of capital-oriented grants, and therefore finds itself, even if it's competing as a finalist for a project, being outspent and out-incented in the final stages of a project. Legal issues include intellectual property rights. We have a strong patent system. It makes it easy to get patents, but it's difficult to move that out into commercialization by other firms. Growing and retaining an entrepreneurial base, which is what takes R&D activities and bridges it to commercialization. There's a lot of efforts there. Those can be improved considerably. And then finally, an area where the U.S. has a natural advantage is that a lot of companies in advanced manufacturing would like their research and development to be in relatively close proximity to their key cutting-edge manufacturing locations. They would like to put R&D in this country, but when you can do it in a neighboring country or a different country around the world for a fraction of the price, that overcomes, a fraction of the cost, that overcomes a natural tendency to be close. So there's some low-hanging fruit that the U.S. could grab to help stem this tide of R&D, but it's a wide range of policies that would take that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sweeney. Dr. Thursby, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Gingrich. I'm going to be high-tech today, so we're going to go to PowerPoint. I'm going to talk about the results of a survey that Marie Thursby and I conducted in 2005. It was R&D intensive firms, about half of them in the U.S. and half of them in Western Europe. Now, we were asked to talk about recent trends in R&D activity, and in our survey we actually asked that of our respondents. We said, do you anticipate a substantial change in worldwide distribution of R&D employment
in the next 3 years. 209 respondents answered the question. 62% said, no, we're not anticipating a change. Of those anticipating a change, we said, is it going to be an increase or a decrease? Well, you can see up here that the primary increase is indeed going to be India and China, and there's going to be a net decrease in the United States and Western Europe. To give a little bit of perspective there, that's 23 firms in both U.S. and Western Europe who are anticipating a decrease in R&D employment in the United States, 15 anticipating an increase, so a net change of 8 firms, which is less than 4% of our sample. But you see, a lot's going to China and India. Now let me go to the next panel. Well, we asked them if they could identify a recently established or planned facility outside the home country. If they could, we asked them questions about that facility. We asked them, can you think of a recently established or planned R&D facility within the home country? If you can, we're going to ask you questions about that. 235 sites were identified. We get a slightly different picture here when we look at realizations versus their expectations. Realizations here, the bulk of these facilities have been in the U.S. and Western Europe. Now, 80% of these facilities, more than 80%, were actually established since year 2000 or were in a planning phase at the time that we did this. So the evidence here is mixed. They're saying one thing about anticipation, but when you look at the realizations of the recent past, you're getting a slightly different picture. How about factors and what drives them to go to these particular locations? And notice we are asking about factors involved with specific locations, not what do you think is a reason about why you want to go to a location. What really led you to that? If you look at facilities in emerging countries and facilities in developed countries, you get a very different picture. So the most important factors for going into an emerging economy, the most important factor are output markets, and we've heard quite a bit of that today. That's growth potential of those countries. Second most important to these particular firms for the facilities they established in emerging markets, second most is quality of R&D personnel. Tied for third is costs, which are equally important university factors. Detractors, weak IP protection in emerging markets. Now, if you go to developed countries, so the sites are actually in developed countries, the bulk of these are in the U.S. and Western Europe. The most important factors are quality of people that they can hire and strong IP protection, and those are equally important for these firms in establishing these particular facilities. Next, the access to high-quality university faculty and being able to collaborate with those universities, then output markets. There were no detractors identified for going into developed markets. Notice that cost is not there as a detractor for a developed market. Also notice what's not up there, and we did ask about, one of which is legal requirements to enter markets. They said, no, that was not influencing decisions. We asked them about tax breaks and direct government support as a reason for going to those countries. On average, that was not important. For a few firms, that was important, but on average, it was not important. And we asked them about regulatory restrictions. Fewer regulatory restrictions which might attract them to particular markets. No, that was not important. We also asked them about type of science, a question that was proposed to us. What are they doing when they actually go there? So we broke science into 2 categories. One we call familiar science or familiar technology. It's sort of routine science versus new technology or sort of cutting-edge science. So we like to think of it as new science versus familiar science. As you see here, the vast majority of the effort in emerging economies is in routine science. The new stuff, the important stuff, the cutting-edge stuff is all taking place in developed economies. By the way, the most important factor to determining whether or not new science versus routine science is taking place, universities. Finally, to sort of sum up the major conclusions, there's some indication of movement of R&D from developed to emerging, but the recent and strategically important facilities are in developed economies. Location decisions are complex and varies according to whether the site is an emerging economy or a developed economy. Most important factor for emerging economy, market factors. For developed economies, R&D personnel and IP protection. Universities are always important. Costs are not important in developed economy sites. They are tied with universities of importance in emerging economy sites. And the relative importance of factors for new science versus familiar science, universities are very, very important in this, and very little new science is being conducted in emerging economies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Thursby. Now we move to the question phase of our proceedings, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. These 5-minute periods, as you all have already experienced, go very, very quickly. I'd like to get in at least 2 questions. The first one, narrow cast, and then the second one, a broader question to the entire panel. Dr. Atkinson, you referred to some incentives or some inducements to locate R&D facilities as close to, if not unfair trade practices. Can you elucidate what some of those practices might be that border or cross the line on as unfair trade practices?
Yeah, clearly one is tying market access to the facility, to putting a facility in a country. I'm aware of a major U.S. firm that was told if it wanted to access the Chinese market, it had to establish an R&D facility in Beijing, which it did, and it put 500 researchers there. It was not planning to do that. It wanted to do the R&D domestically here in the U.S. Now, you can argue, well, some of the surveys don't quite pick that up. Actually, some of the surveys that I've seen actually do pick that up, particularly the IRI survey. And anecdotally, you hear it a lot. One of the reasons surveys may not pick that up as much is companies are in a bind. They have no market. They have no bargaining power, really. The only bargaining power will be, again, the U.S. government versus foreign governments on this, because companies are not going to say, we're not going to blow the whistle on this, because then they don't get market access. So some other company will get that market access. That's the principle. That's I think one of the principal things. You can make an argument that, at least under some of the EU rules, for example, that some of these very, very large subsidies are a violation of the WTO. We just issued a report called The Rise of the New Mercantilist Unfair Trade Practices in the Innovation Economy, which I'll be happy to submit. But it listed a wide array of these practices: standards manipulation, intellectual property theft. Another problem is that companies will move facilities there, and then the IP will be stolen, frankly, and the government will do almost nothing, in fact, sometimes turning a blind eye to it. And then that IP goes to U.S. competitors, who then produce product as well. So,
If you could submit that to the committee, I would deeply appreciate it. And now, more broadly to the panel, in my personal experience in Oregon, we began by attracting manufacturing facilities for the semiconductor industry, and then a lot of R&D facilities followed. And sometimes R&D facilities follow manufacturing. Sometimes manufacturing follows R&D. Could you all address for me, please, the factors that you see that drive either one, and particularly how manufacturing might follow R&D overseas, and R&D might follow manufacturing overseas?
Well, I think it probably depends on the country. At this point, and I'll speak about India and China, and I won't speak about any other countries. At this point, I think you're getting R&D following manufacturing to China. But that's also mixed, of course, with this exploding Chinese market that you want to access. So in that particular case, R&D is following manufacturing. Though there's other R&D in China that's very high-end R&D, I have to caveat that, or disagree a little bit with the previous presentation. You have extremely high-end R&D in China, in the Microsoft Research Lab in Beijing, also in the Google Lab in Bangalore. I've been there. These are PhDs from only the Stanfords, Berkeleys, and MITs, not from second-tier institutions. This is absolute cutting-edge research at the finest level in the world. In the case of India, where R&D and services are what the Indians are doing, there hasn't thus far been that much movement of manufacturing following R&D. And I think if it does move to India, it'll probably be for the domestic market, like the new Nokia operation there. So in certain cases, there's a linkage. In many others, I would say we don't see that linkage.
Historically, in the regional science literature, what has been the predominant view is that you have this product cycle, and you start off with innovation and creation of new product. through the R&D process, and then the sort of first stage production usually is proximate to that because you're working out the bugs and all that. And then eventually, as production matures, becomes more commoditized, it becomes locationally free and goes to all offshore. I think one of the dangerous views, though, I think that's emerging now in the U.S. is that model no longer holds, and that we don't really need to worry about R&D. It's manufacturing that's important, and R&D no longer is tied to manufacturing. And I think I'd agree with Dr. Kenney. I think there are cases where that's true, where R&D follows manufacturing. There are also just as many, if not more, cases where R&D leads to manufacturing. You've seen that in Israel, for example, which, by the way, has of all the countries in the world, has the biggest R&D to GDP ratio increase. I mean, they've just gone gangbusters, and they've been able to, out of that R&D, create production that still stays in Israel. So I do think that it's a complex issue. I don't think it's one where we can just say R&D doesn't lead to manufacturing. I think it does in many cases.
I think the reason why we found so much familiar science in emerging markets is because that science is actually following sales in those markets, it's following manufacturing. A lot of that is product localization. Yes, there are some cutting-edge science being done in China, but it's not a lot of it. In fact, where you really find it is in things like Microsoft or a fermentation, apparently the Chinese are excellent in. So I think that panel shows that what is going there is, by and large, supporting sales, which in that earlier panel I showed that was the most important reason for going into setting up R&D in emerging markets, was because of the growth potential in those markets and because they want to support sales in those markets. When you talk to business executives who set up R&D labs, what you continually hear is that our company is afraid not to be in China and India because that's a huge growth market. If we're not there now, we're sort of behind the eight ball ultimately. And one way they enter those markets is R&D, and I think it is probably true. Some of the R&D may precede manufacturing, but I think a lot of it is following. So we're going to put manufacturing into China, we're going to put manufacturing into India, and it is natural to have R&D follow that manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other member of the panel?
I would just like to interject something. China is manufacturing. The R&D in India has not followed manufacturing. That's just a fact. I just want to be very clear that those two countries are very different countries. And the way they're being inserted into the global economic system is quite different. So when you talk about R&D following manufacturing, I think in the case of China, that's quite correct. In the case of India, there just isn't that much multinational manufacturing there. It is now starting to come in. So I think we need to be very careful that we look at different countries. Dr. Atkinson referred to Israel. Again, a very different insertion in the global economy, very much at the very highest end of global research. I mean, what's going on in Israel is, for all intents and purposes, equivalent to Silicon Valley. And you can see it. I do a lot of work on the globalization of the venture capital industry. You can see it in the investments that are made in each of those geographies by the VCs. And I'm talking about Sequoia, I mean the elite U.S. VCs, and of course the domestic VCs. So you have to be very careful. They look at the world, as all firms do, and think about what are the assets there and what will be the assets there. And I think that's a better way to look at it if you want to be very granular. At the more general scale, then one can have different kinds of answers, but I'm pretty granular on this.
If I may just take advantage of my position as chair here to drill down one further step. In looking at this difference between India, China, and Israel, are those market forces driving this, human talent forces driving this, or government policy forces driving this, or what's the combination of things that are driving these differences between those three different developmental patterns? Sweeney?
And I think it might have been brought up earlier, the first and foremost factor is going to be the availability of talent. So all the other factors won't matter too much if these locations didn't have the presence of the type of talent that's needed. Now, once that talent is established, then the other factors can make a difference. And I think cost for some types of activities is going to be very important, particularly if the cost differences for accessing that talent are dramatic. So I think it's a combination of market forces forcing companies to look where they can do this best, finding where the talent is, and then finding among that smaller set of location that presents the best cost and benefit profile within that picture.
Perhaps we could return to this in a moment. Let me recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Dr. Gingrey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Sweeney's comments about talent, I think, are very apropos. And of course, as all of you know, that this committee, the Science and Technology Committee, and particularly the Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation, we've really done a lot of work in the America Competes Act in regard to trying to solve that talent problem. And I think, $10 million or whatever to 10,000 minds or whatever the title was. But I mean, it's important work, and we've done a good job on that. And I think we're addressing this disparity, and we will continue to do that. Obviously, more needs to be done. But as Mr. Sweeney just said, if the talent is not here, and the talent is there, whether you're talking about China or India or Israel or wherever, that's first and foremost. And if the talent is here in an equal quantity and quality, then I think the cost factor really raises its ugly head, if I can say ugly, not being too pejorative about cost, because I think it is important. But I wanted to, my question then is, we'll continue to work on this, on the talent factor, and indeed maybe even the cost factor. But Dr. Atkinson, when you, in your testimony, you were talking a little bit about this, the National Innovation Foundation, and I would particularly like to pursue that question with you and the other witnesses in regard to that, if this is the direction that you and maybe the other witnesses think we need to go in, or is there some difference of opinion about that?
Well, thank you. As I said, this is a new report that we'll be issuing jointly with the Brookings Institution, I believe, in early 2008. And one of the spurs of looking at this issue was initial research that we had done that showed that many countries now, particularly in the last decade, have established analogs to their science agencies, and have also established these innovation or technology agencies. So, for example, the UK just established theirs earlier this year. Korea just established theirs in 2002. Finland has a premier entity called TECHUS, which, if I'm not advocating we would fund it at this level, but if they were funding it at the level of per capita, if we funded it at that level, we would be investing $33 billion a year. I mean, that's the level of commitment that they have made to this. What I would envision this doing is certainly not industrial policy, certainly not picking winners and losers, but really doing two main kinds of things. One is there's a program that you may be aware of called MARCO, the Microelectronics Advanced Research Corporation, which is a DARPA-funded initiative with the semiconductor industry. And it funds, I think, I don't remember the number, 6 or 7 focus centers at universities around the country. And what they've done is the semiconductor industry realized they can't invest in R&D that's 6 to 10 years out. It's just too risky for them in this global competitive market. So by partnering with DARPA and industry money and putting together a roadmap of where they see these real technical and scientific challenges, they then have worked with universities to do that. I think that's a very, very good model, and I think I would see this National Innovation Foundation as supporting more of that. The second key issue, and we alluded to it a little bit, is the states are a very important player here. I ran a state economic development for the governor of Rhode Island, and one of the things that states do is they invest in a lot of the kinds of things that's really inappropriate for the federal government to do, where federal government's too large, it's too distant. But the states, Oregon being a good example, they have a nanotechnology initiative, a biotech initiative. But the states underinvest in those because I worked for a governor. I understand you got a term, and those benefits oftentimes accrue after your term of office is over, or they may spill over to the next state. So I think a federal-state partnership to help states do this kind of technology-led economic development, do more of it, would be an important role. So thank you.
Any others want to comment on that as well? We have a little more time.
Yeah,
Thanks, Dr. Kenney.
I think that each of these nations, you mentioned Israel, China, and India, have different strategies. India is basically tax rebates for call centers, R&D, whatever you'd like. Very straightforward, sort of almost a vanilla envelope type of benefits. China, of course, has R&D, subsidizes R&D or gives tax benefits for both domestic and multinational firms. I think the real, and of course some property, real estate, that's often not the national government, but the various provincial, Shanghai, Beijing, give real estate rebates. And the other thing that Dr. Atkinson said is there's pressure. Most of it you're not actually going to be able to see. It's informal pressure from bureaucrats saying, you know, hey, you've got a nice market here. We would love to see an R&D facility, not a mandated, you must have an R&D facility. So it's going to be very hard to pick up. And it's subtle pressure. So I think that's pretty clear. Israel is very interesting. Israel invested in R&D. First of all, attracted American manufacturing and R&D facilities, Motorola, Intel, a number. This was back in the 80s. Then developed a very sophisticated subsidy program for its venture capital industry, and is sort of a case study of brilliance and good management. And I think we could learn something from how Israel organized the attraction of R&D, the movement upstream of the marketplace. But you have to understand that is both a small country and a country that makes investments in R&D and educating its workforce on a probably unparalleled scale, except perhaps Northern Europe. So I think there's a lot to learn from the way the Israelis built an entrepreneurial economy, built their venture capital industry. I think Steve Morris is absolutely right. The United States is going to compete through entrepreneurship in the future. And we have to continue to figure out ways to incentivize venture capital, to incentivize entrepreneurship. We need to look at the university technology licensing offices as to whether they're transferring the technology out there quickly or they're becoming bureaucratic fetters to the transfer of technology. And I don't think we've really looked at that very seriously in our research. So that's one area that I would really put my finger on and say we might continue to think about that.
Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired. When in the second round, I would like maybe for Dr. Thursby to address that point that Dr. Kenney just made at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gingrey. And now the gentlelady from California, Ms. Richardson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge our ranking Republican member, Dr. Gingrey. I'm happy to hear you say, Dr. Gingrey? I'm happy to hear you say that you're willing to look at the costs. That's very encouraging to me. So the fact that I think we all realize we need to be competitive, but at some point we realize there's going to have to be a cost associated to it.
Absolutely.
And your leadership of even willing to get that and say, yeah, that's something we might need to look at, I think is very encouraging. So I wanted to compliment you before you make your mad dash. The second thing, going specifically into the questions that I had, Dr. Kenney and I think Dr. Gingrey was going down that pathway. Can you elaborate specifically on how university technology licensing rules affect our competitiveness? Can you give us more specifics?
I think Bob Lighton and from the Kauffman Foundation has recently put out a report on the role of university licensing offices in frustrating the technology. Most of what I know is anecdotal from my university and others about how difficult it is to work through a university bureaucracy that doesn't know the technology often as well as the inventor herself or himself. and therefore actually becomes an unknowledgeable intermediary between either the venture capitalist, if we're talking about a spin-out sort of situation, for those of us in California is quite important, or the large firm. And this, particularly the IT firms, have been very upset about how the tech licensing offices are controlling IT technology, and Intel and IBM, I know, have actually started a consortium to create a set of new rules for tech transfer from IT and CS departments. So it also probably depends on the particular technology, as I outlined in my statement, the particular industrial linkages. Is it an entrepreneurial situation versus a licensing to a large firm? I think it's across that spectrum of industries and departments. There hasn't been that much research that has looked at that. Most of the research that's being done right now on tech transfer comes out of the AUTUM data, the Association for University Technology Managers database. That database is actually, and I've done some research looking at all entrepreneurial firms coming out of universities like UC Davis, Wisconsin, Illinois, and that is just a subset of all the technology that comes out. So AUTUM itself, the research has not looked at the full spectrum of firms that are coming out. So I'd say that right now we don't have the research to really know this. So I have mostly anecdotes that I hear from people around the country, scientists who are trying to move tech out and are having difficulties with their tech licensing office.
As you find specific information, if you could supply it to this committee, that would be helpful. My second question, more to Mr. Sweeney, but I think it applies to most of those on the panel. Could you provide this committee specific examples of China, India, and Israel of policies that they did implement? We talked about them fairly broadly. I mean, you alluded to Israel. You know, we said, well, China does this, India does that, but nothing specific. And I think really, hopefully, the power of this committee is that at some point we could bring forward some legislative proposals that might mirror and help us to be more competitive. So if we could get some specific language of what some of these countries have done, that would, I think, enable us to better consider economically if it's something that we can do as well.
Yes, I'd be glad to address that. I will defer the India, China, Israel comments to my colleagues here, and do want to remind everybody that it's not just those three countries for which we compete with R&D. The developed countries are more than just the U.S. I'm assuming that's not a fire alarm. Is that correct? Just on this continent, Canada has a aggressive federal tax credit for R&D throughout the country that is complemented by provincial policies, and that varies from province to province. Some provinces are very aggressive. Part of the value of those tax credits for one of our clients in particular is that they were refundable credits. So you get a credit for the amount of capital that you invest in research and development. If you do not have a tax liability early on, and typically you don't, to capture that credit, it will be refunded as cash. So it's a very capital favorable type of credit that has an immediate high impact on the location decision because it addresses an upfront cost. Away from specific company policies like tax credits and grants, Canada also has invested in research institutes. The oil sands area of northwest Canada is one of the biggest booming areas in the world right now with activity. Most of that started with government-funded research, with hundreds of researchers in government research labs developing the ability to economically extract energy from the oil sands and shales of northern Canada. So it's a combination of spending money on research institutes at a government level or a public-private partnership level, as well as tax credits and other types of benefits to influence specific companies. Those types of things have worked very, very well for Canada. They are starting to work well even in Europe. Overall, that chart may show Western Europe having a declining amount of R&D, but the EU has focused on that as something they need to address, and even a country like France has now largely, dramatically increased their tax credits for R&D. So there are very specific tax credits and expenditure programs out there.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Sweeney, and I thank the gentlelady. We have just gotten notice of 6 votes upcoming on the floor, and if it is acceptable to the members of the panel, what I'd like to do is to try to get through one round of questions for everyone and perhaps a follow-up for Dr. Gingrey, for Dr. Thursby, and gentlelady would yield. I'd like to proceed with the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
I'm sorry, Chairman. I would, though, like to clarify that I made a specific request. Could each of you who have information about specific policies, because it did make up the majority of the conversation that we had today, that you could supply us with those specifics of those various, whether it's companies or countries, so we could have some specific things to review. Okay, thank you.
That request will be made, and I'm sure the witnesses will be happy to supply that in writing. Mr. Matheson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just ask one question at this point. An issue that has gotten a lot of discussion in the political dialogue of our country recently, in general, has been our country's immigration policy. But it seems to me one aspect of immigration policy that has not received much attention is impacts of our current immigration policy with respect to highly skilled workers in this country. And I think that this discussion today about how this country positions itself in terms of being competitive in the R&D world, it's relevant to at least ask the committee about their opinions about how our current immigration policy is affecting both our academic centers in this country and also the private sector in attracting bright people that can encourage development of solid R&D within our country. And I just throw that question out to the panel.
I'd like to take first comment on that, if I may. As we've said, I think, pretty consistently here, the ability to attract talent is the primary driver in the initial stages of location decisions for R&D. When you look for attracting talent, you want to see if the talent is where you're looking. But in addition, you want to be able to recruit and retain that talent to the community that you're considering. That gets into a lot of quality of life issues, but even before that, because the production of this talent is no longer the dominant domain of the U.S. in terms of producing PhDs, R&D firms recognize that their recruitment is going to be on a global basis. So their question is, how effectively can I recruit globally the talent that I need to staff and develop my facility? The U.S. is no longer the primary source of internally grown talent and is no longer the easiest location in which to recruit that talent. Somehow the U.S. policy has to balance the security concerns with the need to recognize that the talent that this country needs to succeed is available throughout the world. Other communities and countries, Singapore and Montreal, are both very, very effective at not only growing the talent, but especially in recruiting globally the talent that they need, and both of them have become very strong R&D centers.
I don't think anybody in this panel would disagree that it's very, very important to have high-quality people coming into the U.S., but I want to go a step beyond that. And I think there's a looming problem with keeping them in the United States is because the opportunities for them back in their home country is much, much greater. I give that, this is anecdotal evidence, incidentally, which I typically don't like. I rather do systematic. But I know of one professor at Georgia Tech who had been there for 23 years. He was Indian, and he returned home because he had now better opportunities in India than he would have had, than he had 23 years ago. Another firm in our survey established a facility in China simply because they had a Chinese scientist who they valued greatly who wanted to go home to China. So the only way the firm was going to keep them was to put a facility in China and put that fellow in charge of that. So I think the issue is a little broader than just bringing them in. It's keeping them here once they get here because it's becoming they can maintain the same lifestyle now in many areas of China and India that they can maintain in the U.S., and they can be home. So
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Mitchell? No questions. Then, Dr. Gingrey, you had a follow-up question.
Mr. Chairman, yes, and if Dr. Thursby will follow up to the question that maybe Dr. Kenney asked rhetorically in regard to the universities and licensing and transferring technology and
I need that one, don't I? What I'd really like to talk about here is the importance of federal funding for R&D facilities. We have pulled out healthcare from other industries, and of course, the federal funding of healthcare has been pretty dramatic in the last 20 years. And if you look at where the target for R&D and healthcare happens to be, it's the U.S. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, but I think the primary reason that the U.S. is a target is because for so many years there's been substantial funding in healthcare, which has created a base of high-quality people that these firms can hire, as well as labs within universities where knowledge can spill over into these firms. And that was simply all I wanted to add to that.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the entire panel. And before we bring the hearing to a close, I want to thank all of you and all the participants. The record will remain open for additional statements from members and for answers to follow-up questions, and I will have at least several written questions that I did not get an opportunity to ask from the dais today. The witnesses are excused, and the hearing is now adjourned. Thank you all very, very much.